If you do have any questions, please enter them in the chat function, and Sarah will mediate those questions later on. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass over to Scott, who is, as I say, going to talk about musical milestones, a composition that changed the direction of music history. Have you got Hey Jude on it, Scott?
Funnily enough, no, there's no Hey Jude.
Okay, so I'm sorry the talk will be incomplete, everyone. But nevertheless, do enjoy it. And Scott, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Headmaster, and good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. And thank you for joining me this evening for this little talk, in which I'm going to consider some of the moments in music history where the path of composing has been changed forever. My plan is to look briefly, and it will be quite brief, at 6 pieces from the last 200 years, moments where music history has taken a sudden turn in a different direction, works of art that are so monumental in their importance that they affect everything that comes afterwards. So I'm going to look at 6 pieces that, in my view, come under that category. It was hard to know where to start when thinking about this. I wondered about beginning with the invention of the clef, for example, and writing down of music, Guido d'Arezzo, or maybe the inventing of the printing press as well, another monumental sort of occasion. The invention of the piano, all these things had huge impact. But I decided, just because of time, that I would start a little bit later than that. So we're going to begin my little talk in Vienna in 1805. Hopefully this will work. How do I get that to go? There we go. That's a bit right. So Vienna, there's Vienna, 1805, and if you'd been in Vienna in 1805, you would have been able to hear a very unhappy orchestra being rehearsed by this young man, Herr Beethoven, being rehearsed in his Eroica Symphony, and at the first rehearsal, they would have been met with the challenge of playing this opening. The opening of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, one of the most extraordinary and radical compositions ever created, that was originally dedicated, of course, to Napoleon Bonaparte. Beethoven had been very taken by the changes that had occurred in France, the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty and egalitarian ways of thinking was something that Beethoven was very taken with, and he was convinced that Napoleon was going to be the future of Europe and of mankind, and was therefore distraught on hearing the news that Napoleon had declared himself Emperor of France. He was so upset by this news that he famously scratched Napoleon's name off the front page of the score, and you can see there where Napoleon's name had originally been. Scratching it so hard that he ripped through the paper. And instead it was dedicated to the memory of a great man. What's extraordinary about this piece, and the reason why it changes music history, is just the remarkable ambition of the music. The fact that, for starters, the scale of it, the first movement. And so at this time, a symphony, typically by Haydn, let's say, or Mozart that came before this, would have lasted in the region of 25-30 minutes. Well, the first movement of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony alone lasts around 20 minutes if played with repeats. And somebody in the audience famously did say that they'd happily pay the entrance fee again if only it would stop. But the extraordinary scale of the work is one of the most remarkable features. And the other extraordinary thing about it is the fact that the music contains dissonance and rhythmic ambiguity, and all sorts of musical effects that the likes of which had never been imagined before. Here's a little bit from the first movement. So what's happening here is that Beethoven is taking music away from the court, away from the aristocracy, and making it clear that music is not merely entertainment, but is something that's capable of having a profound message, of communicating to all of mankind, and representing all of mankind's kind of ambitions. It's the sheer ambition of the work that is the most remarkable thing. And no composer coming after this piece and Beethoven's other essays in the symphonic realm were able to ignore what Beethoven had achieved. And every composer in the 19th century has in some way got to respond to Beethoven. There's a famous picture of Brahms sat with a statue with a bust of Beethoven above his shoulder. The suggestion being that Brahms was following on in Beethoven's legacy. And every composer needed to respond in some way to what Beethoven had achieved in the Eroica Symphony. So much so that the next composer I'm going to talk about declared the symphony to be dead. He felt that everything that could be said in the realm of the symphony had been said, and there was nothing more to say. And so Richard Wagner, who's the next composer I'm hoping to talk about, there he is, his achievements, of course, were in the realms of opera. Now, Wagner, of course, famous for writing these huge long operas, notably his Ring Cycle, 4 operas that last about 16 hours in total to perform across 4 evenings. But in the middle of writing the Ring Cycle, Wagner was introduced to a book by the German philosopher Schopenhauer. There's Schopenhauer. The book by Schopenhauer is called The World as Will and Representation, 3 volumes. I can't claim to have read it. Now, Schopenhauer, as you may be aware, is of course the great nihilist in philosophy terms. He's the philosopher who sort of suggested really that there was very little point in striving to try and achieve. That there was nothing that there was no way of finding happiness really, true fulfillment in life, and our attempts to try and do this were going to fail, and this was an incredibly influential and important way of thinking in the middle of the 19th century. Lots of artists were greatly influenced by this, and Wagner decided that he would write an opera using the story of Tristan and Isolde to try and explore these sorts of Schopenhauerian themes. So, what the story of Tristan and Isolde is Tristan is a sailor, and he's taking Isolde on a ship off to marry somebody else, but on the journey they fall absolutely madly in love, but they know that they can't be together. So they resolve this by both drinking a love potion to begin with to intensify their love, and then they drink a death potion and they both die. And at the end of the opera, that's kind of how the thing is resolved, as it were, in death. Now, Wagner needed to try and find a way in music of capturing this sense of there being no resolution, of nothing kind of being resolved, nothing kind of being satisfied. And this is what Wagner came up with. I'll just play you a little bit of the Wagner. the famous opening of Wagner's Tristan Prelude with the Tristan chord. I've got a little keyboard here. I'll just play the chord. That famous chord, and that chord is able to go in any direction it likes harmonically. You can go off into any key from that chord. You can go off into any kind of harmonic place. But that's not the key to it, really. The key to it is actually the next chord and the fact that the phrase ends on this sound. I hope you can hear the keyboard. The music ends not on the tonic, but on the dominant. So it should do this. Perhaps, and come to a conclusion, but it doesn't. And it doesn't just not do that then, it carries on not doing that for 3 hours. And only at the end of the opera, when you have the extraordinary sort of the Liebestod, as it's called, the death's love, and everybody is about to die, only then do we get lots and lots of perfect cadences. Let's just hear how Wagner builds this extraordinary climax in the prelude, as he over and over again he refuses to make the music resolve. So Wagner, they're refusing to let the music find a place of repose. Now, the reason why this is so important, apart from the fact that it's an extraordinary and wonderful and beautiful way of capturing this emotional sense of unease, the reason why it's so important for composing history, as it were, is that it began to open the door to the idea that you didn't need to have a tonic in music, that you didn't have to resolve. For the previous 400 or 500 years, music had always been based around a certain note. And Wagner essentially is just starting a fire underneath a process here that leads to all the advances of later in the 19th century and the 20th century. And so in many ways, he's kind of opening up a can of worms with this piece. And again, it's something that people couldn't ignore following what came afterwards. Now, the next composer I'm going to talk about this piece is generally said to be the first piece of modern music. A composer who really disliked Wagner, even though his music is actually full of Wagner, whether he liked it or not. The composer, there he is Claude Debussy, the French composer. And in 1894, he was working towards a style of composing that in many ways would be similar to the achievements of the French Impressionist artists, and perhaps in many ways more like the French symbolist poets. And indeed, the Prélude à la Première d'Enfant, which is the orchestral piece that we're going to listen to a tiny bit of, is based on a poem by Mallarmé, the French symbolist poet. What Debussy was looking for was to try and capture. Well, first of all, I'll just say that the Prelude in the Morning of the Faun, which obviously is what that means. A faun, there's a faun. A faun is a half man, half goat mythical creature that lies on the side of Mount Etna in Sicily and plays its flute and suns itself in the sun. And the piece is meant to be capturing the dreams of this mythical animal. Now, Debussy was trying to capture the same kinds of vagaries, if you like, and uncertainties that characterize Impressionist painting. He was trying, rather than paint something to look the way that it looks in real life. These artists are trying to capture the essence of something, perhaps trying to capture movement, trying to capture the effect that light has on subjects. And Debussy was looking for a similar effect in music. So let's hear the opening, the famous opening of his Prélude à l'après-midi d'enfant. And then I'll talk a little bit about the way that Debussy is creating the effect that he creates. So I'm just going to use my keyboard again. I hope you can hear it. So this famous opening flute tune that was played by, I forget the name of the French flautist who played it, but he was famous for being able to play in the lower register of the flute in a very beautiful way. They were kind of inventing this new way of playing the flute with a vibrato at the time. And the melody is unaccompanied, so there's no harmony. So you don't quite know, in a sense, exactly where you are in terms of harmony. And the melody is constructed across a tritone. Now, many of you will know that the tritone is the least stable of all musical intervals. Here's the sound of a tritone. In medieval times, it was known as the devil in music, Diabolus in musica, and it's got no sort of particular harmonic stability to it at all. And the melody that we just heard goes up and back and forth between the top and bottom of a tritone. Which leaves us rather unsure as to exactly what key we might be in. It's also rhythmically very unclear as well. There's no particular pulse to the music, and it's very difficult to work out exactly what the beat is. And so what Debussy is doing, in effect, is he's blurring the music around the edges. Also what he does is that when the music, when that melody, repeats, he harmonizes it in different ways. So again, the meaning, if you like, of the melody notes, which are kind of given by the harmony, perhaps, the meaning is changing all the time. The meaning is somewhat blurred. So when the melody first appears, it's unaccompanied. The second time it appears, it's harmonized like this. And the third time, that first note's harmonized like this. So he uses different chords to harmonize the melody. With the effect of trying to create this impressionist sound in the music, although he wasn't actually very keen on the idea of being called an impressionist. It's perhaps worth mentioning at this point that, of course, that impressionist painting by 1894 was really rather old hat, and it was very much in the post-impressionist era at that time, weren't we? Whereas, of course, music is sort of rather slower catching up, and that is very often the case, that music as an art form runs behind the other arts. I think the reason for that, although I'm happy to be told other reasons, but certainly one reason is, of course, that music is rather expensive as an art form. It involves lots of resources and people, and therefore tends to be controlled by sort of the larger authorities like the church, the state, the courts in the aristocratic times and that sort of thing. And of course, people who have lots of money and power tend not to be terribly radical in their approach very often, although there are exceptions to that, which I think is one reason, certainly, why music tends to move behind the other arts. Now, later in the piece, Debussy composes what is, and I've tried not to be too self-indulgent in this talk, but I am going to play you a minute or so of what I think is one of the most beautiful moments in all of music, the extraordinary sort of central theme that comes in this piece. And for a while here, the music does seem to be quite sort of clearly in a key, very stable harmonically. But if you listen carefully, you'll hear in the bass that the key is actually being undermined. The tritone is actually there in the bass. But let's have a listen. just because it's so beautiful. Let's have a listen to the center of this piece. That passage there is full of what we call parallel chords. This is something that that Debussy was very fond of. Essentially, in classical harmony, the way that Debussy would have been taught at the Conservatoire in Paris, you're not allowed to do what are called consecutive fifths or octaves. And this had been the rule right back to the 16th century. So you can't write in your music this, that kind of a sound, or indeed that. And that would have been the case, as I say, for many hundreds of years. And the Wagner that we heard just now and the Beethoven are both following these rules of not using consecutive fifths. But Debussy famously loved the sound of parallel harmony. So parallel harmony is this. Two chords, both with lovely sevenths or ninths that move and shift together, which inevitably creates a whole series of parallel, not allowed intervals. And he was told at the Conservatoire, apparently, you can't do that. That's not allowed. And Debussy said, well, I don't care. It sounds beautiful. I'm going to do it. And so it's by doing these kind of radical things, Debussy throws music forward into the 20th century. And so that's why that piece, I think Boulez it was, Pierre Boulez, the conductor and composer, who called this piece the first 20th century piece. But the piece, in many ways, the next piece I'm going to talk about is the piece that, for a lot of people, is regarded as perhaps the most radical and notorious leap in music history that there ever was. And this is the famous The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. This is the piece where at its first performance in 1913 in Paris, there was a riot. I think it was a rather polite riot, full of lots of rather posh people, I think, not necessarily chucking things around, but there certainly was lots of shouting and shoving, and the police were called. The reason for that, perhaps the reason why there was a riot, wasn't so much to do with the music, apparently, as to do with the costume and the dancing. This is an artist's impression of the dancers. And if you look at their feet, you see the feet are turned inwards, which I understand, I'm led to believe is breaking all the rules of classical ballet. And Nijinsky, who was the choreographer, had encouraged the dancers, told them to turn their feet inwards. And this caused outrage, as indeed did the story, which is all about a young girl dancing herself to death in order to keep the primeval gods happy. But certainly there was a riot at the opening of this piece, much to the delight of Diaghilev, who was the owner of the ballet company, the Ballet Russe. He was thrilled at the publicity, and much to the horror of Stravinsky. And Debussy as well was there, and he is said to have cried out, stop shouting and screaming, let's listen to the beautiful music. The other composer who was there, who didn't understand, was Saint-Saëns, the composer of the Carnival of the Animals. And he is famously supposed to have said, on hearing the opening, that if that's a bassoon, I'm a buffoon. Because as you'll hear in a moment, Stravinsky writes an extraordinary bassoon solo to open this piece. So this is the way that the Rite of Spring opens. And as I say, it may well have been the dancing and the costumes that caused the trouble. About a week later, after this first performance where there had been the riot, there was a concert performance, apparently, of the music of the Rite of Spring, which people enjoyed greatly, and it went down very well. So the music itself may not have been the major cause of the riot, but that's not to take away from the extraordinary radical nature of this music. As in all things, as in probably all the pieces I'm talking about tonight, there's been signs of what's to come in previous pieces. But the leap that Stravinsky makes from his previous two ballets he'd written for the Ballet Russe, Petrushka and the Firebird, the leap that he makes with the Rite of Spring really is remarkable. In Petrushka, he'd been experimenting with what's called bitonality, which is having two keys at once, and you get this sort of sound. So you have a chord of C major and a chord of F sharp major, and then the instruments play in different keys at once. And it's a similar principle that's going on here in the Rite of Spring, but in this piece, the fundamental idea, as Stravinsky called it, the chord on which he builds the piece, is an incredibly dissonant chord. It's these two triads put together, this sound and this sound. You put those together and you get this. And that was the idea that Stravinsky founded the piece on. And this passage I'll play you now shows that chord in all its glory. This is perhaps the most famous passage in the Rite of Spring. Worth saying before I play it, perhaps, that one of the extraordinary achievements about this piece is the way that it brings rhythm to the fore. You know, music had never before been so kind of essentially rhythmic in its essence, rather than melodic or harmonic. Obviously, lots of composers, Beethoven, I guess, you know, very much is incredibly rhythmic in their music. The rhythms play a really important part in lots of music. But this is music where rhythm is at the absolute forefront. So let's hear that now. This is a little bit of a little bit more of the Rite of Spring. Now, rather strangely, Stravinsky himself never composed anything quite like that again. 1913, of course, is when the First World War came along, and everything kind of ground to a halt. And after the First World War, these vast orchestras that music like that requires just simply weren't possible. And Stravinsky, who was extraordinary at reinventing himself, turned to a completely different form of composing. But rather like the Beethoven example I played at the beginning of this little talk, this is a piece that nobody could ignore. The Rite of Spring, its extraordinary rhythmic developments in particular, and the way that it handled dissonance. The whole sound world of this piece was something that no composer in the 20th century was able to ignore. You simply had to respond in some way to Stravinsky, whether you were going to use his techniques or whether you were going to work against them in some way. But you certainly couldn't ignore Stravinsky's achievements. And that's true not only in the realm of classical music, but also in the realms of jazz and pop music as well. And for my final two pieces, I'm going to talk, first of all, about a jazz piece that I think is very influential. And this is the most famous jazz album of all time. I'm sure many of us listening, if not all of us listening, have heard this record. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, created in 1957. I think I'm right in saying, I can't see where it talks about it on my notes. 1959, I'm sorry, 1959, and widely regarded as the most influential jazz album of all time. A little bit of a cliche, perhaps. You know, people say if you're going to have one jazz record, you'd have this one. But there's a reason for that, and that is that it is quite the most remarkable record. There's Miles Davis. It was recorded in 2 days, in about 5 hours, and the guys would rehearse. The 5 of them playing in the band would rehearse and then put down the tracks. Lots of the tracks on the album are just recorded in one take. That's the album, and 6 of them on the album. Sorry, not 5. And there they are working away. At this point in the late 50s, jazz had come to something of a turning point, really. Most of the artists who had dominated the previous 10 years and the bebop era in jazz, as called, most of them were actually dead, unfortunately, because of the lifestyles they led. And the most influential of them, Charlie Parker, had died. And jazz was something I hit a sort of a little bit of a crossroads, really. And Miles comes along with this album and shows the way forward for the next 10, 20 years to jazz musicians. All the guys who play on this record, Bill Evans playing the piano and John Coltrane, etc. They're all really, really, of course, major jazz artists in their own right. And they all went off, having been part of this record, and did their own projects that again took jazz forward. So in that way, this album it deserves its sort of legendary status and its place on everyone's shelf, because it really is an incredibly important album and represents something of a turning point in the history of music. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of the opening of this album. The unmistakable sound of Miles Davis there playing his trumpet. Extraordinary man, of course, Miles Davis himself, and he went forward rather like Stravinsky and never repeated himself. Everything he did following was always very different, and extraordinary kind of creative genius, really. Now, so that brings me to my last choice. One thought I've had in choosing these records, or these pieces, is that, of course, the impact that this music has on us is lost a little bit. And so when we hear Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, we don't hear it, of course, the way that you would have heard it in 1805. And the same is true of the Wagner and the Debussy and so on. And even the Rite of Spring. It doesn't sound to us that extraordinary. Because, of course, we've all been to see films and we've all heard lots of music. We live at, when we live. And there's been lots of other things and more radical things that have happened since. So the impact of these pieces is something that we can't fully share, I don't think, even if we can talk about it and look at the ways in which they're very influential. But for me, anyway, there is my final choice, as it were, is an album that when I first heard, I'm old enough to have been there and to have heard it actually sort of come out and be struck by the fact that it really was clearly quite radical, quite different, and represented a complete change in music. And that was the release in 1997 of OK Computer by Radiohead. So this album is widely regarded as being the most influential album of the last 20 years or so. It was their third album, and the first 2 albums had been quite popular, and in many ways remain more popular perhaps than this album is. But this third album really did constitute an extraordinary leap forward that the band had made. and it's famous for the fact that it seems to sort of look forward into the future in so many ways. And so even though it's written at the end of the 20th century, it does seem to deal with 21st century issues in the most sort of prescient and extraordinary forward-looking way. So the themes you hear on this album to do with consumerism, social alienation, emotional isolation, political malaise, all these things seem terribly relevant to our times. Now I have to admit that I'm personally not somebody who's that taken with lyrics. I don't listen to lyrics very much. It's the music that interests me. And when I first heard this record in 1997, what struck me was that it had this extraordinarily different sound, that I'd never heard any sort of rock music ever that sounded like this. And there may well be music that I'd missed, so I can't claim to have listened to every rock music, but it did strike me as being something in the way that it was produced, the way that it had been composed, the techniques they'd used in the studio, the production techniques. It was something unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and that's why I thought it might be worth including. So I'll just play you a little bit of this track from OK Computer. That extraordinary sort of futuristic sound that the music creates is something that I'd never really heard before. It's been voted the most influential, or rather Radiohead have been voted the most influential band of the last 30 years, and you can see why. Really, it's impossible to imagine the likes of Muse or Travis without Radiohead. And also apparently, so I've read that Kanye West is very lists Radiohead as being one of his major influences. Drake. So all sorts of different artists list that this record as being incredibly important to them. So I thought I would include that one as a final record. So I hope that that very quick and brief introduction to some those 6 pieces has given you. I haven't pressed my buttons on this one. There's the album, and there's the band themselves, led by Tom York, of course. So I hope that's given you some maybe taste of what these pieces have got going on for them. And there's the 6 pieces I've talked about, in case you wanted to maybe look into them further in your own time. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me for the last half an hour or so. And I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Scott. That was, a true musical tour through the ages. We've got, a little bit of time now for some questions. So as Paul said, if you want to pop them in the chat, either to me directly as the host next to my name, or just put them in there to everyone, that's fine as well. We've had a couple of quite big questions come in already. The first of these is, what is your favorite of the pieces you've played today?
My favorite? So, gosh, I think if I could only listen to one of them again, it'd be the Wagner, because the Wagner is just extraordinary, really. So the Wagner is probably my favorite, but they're also different, and they all obviously have so much to offer. But the Wagner probably,
Okay, and another really tricky one. If you could only listen to one era of music forever, which would you pick?
One era of music? I think that would be the Baroque period, because the boys know, my favorite composers are all from the Baroque: Monteverdi, Bach, of course, Handel. So probably the Baroque. Although again, I'm glad I haven't got to make that choice, because the joy is of course in the variety, isn't it really? But yeah, probably the Brock.
Yeah. Another question we've had, do these pieces impact the way you teach music at school level?
Yes, very much. So I sort of feel that these pieces, that it's very important that the kids have access and or have an experience of listening and learning a little bit about these major pieces, these plus other works, you know. So in the course of their time at school here, certainly if a boy or girl was to go through with music right to the end in the sixth form, they would become fairly sort of familiar with all these pieces and other ones as well, of course, which constitute the kind of the major sort of canon of Western art music, really. But yeah, they're very important pieces, really, because of the way that they influence and the way that the composers are influenced by them is the key to it, really.
Right. And we've had sort of a couple of comments. Someone said about the Beatles and the influence of George Martin, and you know how they blended pop and classical themes. Do you consider
Absolutely.
that to be really impactful as well?
Yeah, of course, hugely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did wonder about including. I know they had joked about Hey Jude at the beginning, but certainly Sergeant Pepper's is something that you might well have included in a talk like this. And the work of George Martin obviously was incredibly important. Yeah, absolutely.
Someone else has asked, kind of on that theme, I wondered if you were going to pick Bohemian Rhapsody. Did you consider it?
It's a fascinating piece, isn't it, Bohemian Rhapsody? Because I guess that sort of extraordinary merging of the operatic with the rock idiom is incredible, really. And it's an extraordinary piece. And the thing about that piece as well that always strikes me is just how amazing they are performing. Just how phenomenal, you know, Freddie Mercury in particular, I suppose, but the other guys in that band, just, you know, what extraordinary musicians they are, really. And yeah, so it's certainly a remarkable piece of music. Yeah.
Someone's also asked, if music lags other arts in terms of development, looking at current art banks, etc., where do you think music will go next? Really good question.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure these, well, I mean, maybe these sort of broad generalizations never work, but I think that the way the world is now, that it's, you know, it's so diverse, and we're able to communicate so easily now across the world, and things move at such a speed that I think it's very hard to sort of, you know, spot trends and see how things, what direction things, you know, might go in now. Certainly I can't do it anyway. So I'm not sure, really, but I think it's certainly true that music tends to, certainly historically, music has always moved behind the other arts in a way that I think is quite interesting, really. Is that true now? I don't know. It's hard to say, I think.
Well, thank you. Someone has asked, has Radiohead finally broken down the distinction between serious and popular categories?
Yeah, I think so. I probably not them first. I'm sure that there were those. I guess thinking back to the late '60s when sort of bands like Genesis and then David Bowie, I suppose, you know, these kind of guys were using classical approaches, writing longer pieces of music, let's say, rather than your average sort of 50s style, you know, 2.5-minute pop song. They began to use more classical techniques, and I certainly think there's an awful lot of very beautiful kind of harmonic. I mean, what draws me to Radiohead the most is their use of harmony. Really, they've got an extraordinary kind of ability to use certain kind of chords in certain ways to create, you know, these kind of effects that they create, which is very classical I guess in one sense. Yeah.
I think this is just a personal question off the back of what you were just saying. When you listen to, you know, more popular music now, do you find it quite hard to just enjoy it?
Sorry, it just started by itself. Do I find it hard?
Don't worry.
I'm sorry,
I was going to say, do you
to
find it? to listen to current music without drawing those parallels between, you know, more classical pieces?
No, not really. So I do like music to be harmonically interesting. That for me is kind of what I listen for.
Yeah.
So if something is very simple harmonically, then for me it may not be quite so appealing. But everything's got its own thing, hasn't it? Really, everything's got its own way, and I try not to be snooty about stuff, because obviously it doesn't get you very far in life being snooty. So I try to be as open-minded as I can be. Yeah, but certainly for me, it's always the harmony that draws me in, rather than the lyrics. Let's say the lyrics don't really affect me personally, I'm afraid, very much. I don't know why, but I've never been somebody who listens to lyrics.
Yeah. Someone has asked, just kind of off the back of what we were saying about serious and popular categories earlier, they've said, didn't Bird, as in BYRD, break down the distinction between serious and popular categories?
William Byrd.
I'm going to leave that to you to decide. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly Byrd writes lots of, as all the composers in those days did. They would have written in a sacred style, and also in a secular style. So they'd have composed madrigals alongside writing music for the church, of course. And so in that sense, yeah, composers have always explored different sort of styles, haven't they? I guess suitable to the certain circumstances in which they're having to work. Yeah. So I suppose really, I mean, the distinction, I suppose, is between folk music, let's say, and classical music, so-called classical music, music that's written down, for example, and published, and rather than music that's taught and learned purely by listening, the oral tradition. That, I suppose, is the distinction that is perhaps being talked about. Yeah.
Someone else has asked, you mentioned you were more interested in music than lyrics. Did you consider craft work as a major influence recently?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I can't. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are. I can't say that I'm massively familiar with their work, rather shamefully. But and the other band as well that I should know more about and I don't is Daft Punk. And the other week, one of the sixth formers rather gave us lectured me on the extraordinary virtues of Daft Punk. So I'm going to go and look into their music as well. There's apparently a great deal of interesting stuff there as well, but I don't really know.
Yeah, that's always good when you're learning from them as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're going to leave it there unless anyone's got any last minute questions. But I think we've managed to get through pretty much everything that was asked. Oh, there's one. We'll do one last one. What is so special, in your opinion, about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and why is it so special?
About Beethoven's Ninth Symphony?
Yeah.
So the
ninth.
Yeah. Gosh, there's a question. But of course, the ninth, with its introduction of text and the use of the poetry of it's Goethe, isn't it? I think in the Ninth Symphony, is of course, I suppose and the way the bass voice joins in the last movement and sort of stands up and says, "Enough of this," that's all that we can do. And then from that point forward, it's all given across to the text, and the music has words, and the singing that in itself is obviously very, very powerful, and was taken by Wagner, as I hinted at earlier, really as a sign of the fact that the symphony, as an orchestral music, pure music, absolute music that doesn't necessarily have a kind of obvious meaning, that art form had been exhausted, and so in that sense, that's one of the important aspects of the Ninth Symphony. I think the Ninth Symphony is such an extraordinary challenge, really, for the 19th century that nobody really tackles it, apart from maybe from Wagner. So there's no other. There are choral symphonies, I suppose. Schumann writes a choral symphony, and I think Mendelssohn puts a choir in one of his symphonies. So it is tackled slightly, but it's not until Mahler, really, at the end of the 19th century, 100 years later, that we get a composer who's able to fully take the challenge that Beethoven sets in the Ninth Symphony and run with it and develop it. What's extraordinary about Beethoven is that his 9 symphonies are all so different. I could have chosen any of them, really, in many ways, although the Eroica does represent a massive leap forward. but they're all so different, and they're all such a challenge. And the 19th century composers were able to pick and choose which of them they felt suited them the best, whether they wanted to use the extraordinary drama of the Fifth Symphony, or if they wanted to use the pastoral symphony with its portrayal of the countryside, and all the program music of the 19th century comes from that way of thinking. Or just look at the more absolute pieces like the Seventh Symphony of Beethoven, for example, and use that as their starting point. So that's one of Beethoven's extraordinary things, is just the sheer variety of the achievement. He's quite something, Beethoven. Not my favorite composer, I have to admit. I personally find Beethoven a little bit pompous, the way that he'll say the same thing over and over again and expect you to keep on listening. It's a bit like me perhaps doing this talk, but so he's not my favorite composer, as it happens, but there's no question about the extraordinary influence and the unbelievable importance of his achievement.
Great. Okay, thank you, Scott. I think we'll leave it there, just looking at the time. But yeah, thank you so much for doing that. I think it's very clear to everyone how passionate about your topic you are. So yeah, it was really interesting to hear you talk about all that stuff. We've got lots of messages in the chat of people saying thank you for a great talk, so that's always really nice. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening and sticking with it if you have.
No, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you at the next one.